Welcome to Emerge Education's webinar series. My name is Jim Hunter, and I serve as the Chief Academic Officer and Senior Vice President for Business Development at Emerge Education. Emerge is based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and focuses and partners with higher ed institutions in a number of different ways and provides strategic solutions to meet the needs of our higher ed partners. One of our strategic partners is a company called Risk Cooperative, and the goal of this partnership is to meet higher ed institutions' risk management needs, whether that be cyber risk, physical security, international travel, and study abroad risk, or tuition protection and loan repayment. Risk Cooperative is a specialized strategy, risk, and insurance advisory firm licensed to originate, place, and service innovative risk transfer and insurance solutions in all 50 states. Risk Cooperative helps organizations address risk, readiness, and resilience through a comprehensive service and solution offering in partnership with leading insurance companies and value-adding partners. Risk Cooperative decided to partner with Emerge Education in 2017 to offer their expertise and solutions to our higher ed partners all across the country. Today we are going to be joined by Andreas Franzetti, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and a founding member of Risk Cooperative. He leads the firm's strategy, partnerships, and product innovations. Emerge Education and Risk Cooperative have been working diligently over the past year to design innovative solutions for the risk management and risk factors institutions face today. Today we will be discussing those 21st century risks that institutional leaders face, and those will be related to cyber, physical security, international, and tuition protection. So we welcome Andreas Franzetti to this webinar and look forward to our discussion. So Andreas, thanks again for joining us today in the Emerge webinar focused on risk management and 21st century risk. It's great to have you and your expertise and experience in this environment as we think about higher ed institutions and the complexities of the risk that they face in today's environment, as well as, thinking about specific risks and how leaders are thinking about adapting to those risks, and maybe not even aware of some of the risks that they potentially could face. So thanks again for joining us today.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And certainly, I think there's a lot of change happening right now in our country and around the world. So I think that it's important for organizations, but particularly academic institutions, to start thinking about how they're going to address some of their traditional operating risks, but also some of these new emerging risks and the shifting global landscape. So it's hopefully going to be a good discussion, and we'll provide some good insights on how to do that.
Yeah, that's great. So along those lines, from a broad perspective, Andreas, how have you seen risks develop and change within the first 2 decades of the 21st century?
Well, I think that's a great opening question, and the risk that I think is clearly defining the 21st century is cyber risk, right? I mean, this is a concept that has been around for the last 20 or so years. Yet now it feels that every day we're seeing new stories in the headlines about breaches, and there's so there's something happening that organizations are going to have to address, and not just because of the privacy requirements that are being imposed from regulators, which is a very important component that organizations need to take into consideration, but also because it's becoming what we would call a loss of attraction issue, right? It's becoming an issue reputationally for organizations where folks are not frequenting the establishments that they think will not secure their information or safeguard their information. So this, I think, is also very applicable to universities and academic institutions, as they're dealing with a unique environment in that by the very nature of the work that they're doing and the fostering education and information sharing, they need to operate with a more open environment. Yet at the same time, they're housing a lot of IP, they're housing a lot of research and intellectual property that is very valuable. They're also working with a large student population, a large faculty population, and there's a duty of care to protect those individuals' credentials and IDs. So it is a very challenging time for universities around that area, and we're happy to dive a little bit deeper into that. There's also, I think another threat that is unfortunately becoming more and more commonplace on campuses, and that is the threat of security, of physical security. We're seeing more and more active shooting incidents that are targeting universities and academic institutions. And this is not a new phenomenon, but unfortunately it is one that has continued and has had a significant upswing in recent years. And this is largely because of the, again, open environment that a campus or a university brings, that also has to factor in the what's perceived as a soft target for these individuals that are carrying out these heinous attacks, and then I think a little bit of what we saw this last weekend with UVA is another symbol of things that universities need to be aware of. Sometimes it's events that are outside of their control, such as these types of incidents that can not only generate violence and injury to their faculty and students, but it also creates a reputational risk. So from the operational side of the house, they need to be aware of how can they start mitigating these types of risks. And these are fairly new risks that are now emerging and that they're having to contend with. And in many cases, they don't have the resources or the capabilities in-house to really tackle these threats and risks head on and properly mitigate them so that they don't have as significant a downfall impact, both with the cost of life as well as with the financial components and liability components to the organization.
So you're seeing then that based on the complexities of the risk, that there are gaps, whether in process or policy or in insurance solutions for higher ed institutions today. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that a lot of institutions have very robust risk management practices. They have, there's a lot of insurance programs that have been designed and tailored to the academic domain. Yet they, have missed some of these exposures because they're a bit newer, and the market's still trying to figure out how to best address them. Now, there are some innovative new programs out there that are working to help schools mitigate these exposures, and it really is about now, I think, creating some awareness and looking at it from a strategic vantage point, not just a cost component. When we're looking and evaluating insurance and risk management, it really is something that needs to be looked at on a strategic level, and really determining what solutions are out there that can help build up the resiliency of an organization. Solutions, for example, such as cyber insurance are one way that you're able to not necessarily eliminate the risk of a cyber attack on its own, but you're able to at least provide some liability coverage and some financial transfer capabilities to place the financial risk of paying for a breach response into the insurance market. It also brings with it usually a breach panel. The good policies will have a breach panel capability that allows you to call in experts that will actually go into your systems and recover files, make sure that unknown intruders are identified, and help track any data or information that's been stolen, and ultimately get you back to a secure, safe status. And these are resources that, again, most IT departments, even in some Fortune 1000 companies, they don't have the right resources or skill set to address these risks. There's a large talent gap in the cybersecurity market. So when folks think about cyber insurance, they need to look at it not just as a cost of another insurance policy, but really evaluate it, and evaluate the components of it, and look at it from a resiliency standpoint as to how does that help them become more resilient. Similarly, with the
Mhm.
physical security risks that we talked about, there's programs now that are designed particularly for both workplace and academic institutions, and designed from a more proactive approach. So it's not just about paying for the lawsuits or liability that could arise as a result of a potential active shooting incident. It is really looking at, bringing again that expertise that allows you to do a risk assessment of the campus, identify vulnerabilities, identify early threats, whether it's some statements that have been posted on social media or activities that are going on throughout the campus, is bringing a different perspective that helps to analyze that component, and then developing programs and procedures and plans that can be placed into action in the event that something does happen, and providing that training so that there's preparedness. In many cases, universities have a active shooter procedure or protocol, and they may have run through it once with their team, but it's more difficult to coordinate the crisis response communication of the university president, the interaction with local law enforcement, the emergency
Mhm.
services, and have that funnel through a centralized person in the university, because it becomes a very disorganized and chaotic situation as the event unfolds. So these types of solutions help to bring in those resources. They also do have some liability components to it, so that, again, you're not forced to have to wait for a victims fund to pay out via the state funded operations, which often can be very litigious and lengthy, and it provides, more than nothing else, it extends the life cycle of any event and the trauma to the victims, by having to go through
Mhm.
this very hard scenario. So having that embedded liability, and some of the counseling services and other benefits of these programs allows these organizations to, transfer that financial exposure, and ultimately, safeguard their resiliency and their operations, both from the proactive protection state, and then financially, for these types of events that are, as much as you can prepare for them, they're very hard to predict, and certainly even harder to eliminate outright.
Right. So, it would appear that oftentimes, the response and resiliency comes into play after an event actually happens. So, are there ways that institutional leaders can be, proactive in determining, whether through an assessment or an audit, or with a consulting firm, determining where their gaps are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, that's where, bringing some level of outside expertise is really the best way for organizations to start evaluating what they have in play today, and then looking at their operations overall, not just their campus and immediate operations, but again, if they have programs they're running overseas, or even
Hmm.
sister academic institutions where they're transferring students and programs back and forth, looking at really their entire landscape, and exploring where there's gaps, where there are potential exposures, and also where there's opportunities to de-risk some of these components, so that it's not, again, just about a cost, but in many cases there's the ability to use risk transfer and insurance solutions as a way, as a catalyst for growth. Really, a lot of organizations can limit the downside of potential exposures or investments. For example, business interruption insurance is a common tool that helps to limit the interruption of revenues for an organization, and that enhances their creditworthiness, their creditability. So there's other tools that, not just from the mitigation perspective, there's also tools that can be leveraged that allow an organization to grow. So having somebody come in with
Right.
that different perspective is crucial to really provide more insight.
And you had touched on a bit earlier on really kind of what we're looking at as larger kind of risk management buckets, cyber, physical security. You mentioned briefly international, and then there's also some risk related to tuition protection. So perhaps maybe you could provide some insights into each of those categories or a couple of them, and maybe provide some examples of the types of risks associated with each category. I know in some conversations that we've had with university leaders, there's kind of at the forefront of their minds is this international risk, whether that's international students coming here to domestic institutions or domestic students going overseas for some programming, as well as faculty and staff.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think those are all great points. And international is certainly an area where I think a lot of organizations, not just academic institutions, find it a bit more challenging. And that's because, as you're deploying faculty overseas, in many cases to multiple countries, or have programs that you're running with students traveling for varying periods of time to a multitude of different countries, it requires a bit more risk analysis, and it also requires a bit more coordination. And there are limited providers that can offer these types of services. So some of the key
Hmm.
areas that we've seen organizations encounter in terms of risk or plan management are really around, for example, if you have faculty that are stationed overseas and for long-term assignments, is providing them with appropriate health insurance programs. And in many cases, organizations leave it up to the individual to go in country and source coverage, but that ultimately leads to having a varying degree of coverage by faculty member by country, which creates some issues, and it also creates liability issues and duty of care issues for organizations that are sending folks overseas without the adequate insurance or protection. It also creates, in many cases, a retention issue, because if individuals don't have the benefits and access to sort of the basic needs that they need to feel secure and taken care of overseas, odds are that they're going to not stay with that organization, or they're not going to stay on that assignment. So it creates operational issues and knock-on effects for the organization. So that's one area. Another key one is evacuation and safety protocols. Making sure that you have the right procedures in place, so that if there's an event in any given location where your folks are traveling to, you know how you're going to get them out, you know what the protocols are. And that's another instance where a risk transfer solution or insurance solution provides a lot of value to an organization, because they're not paying for the highest cost at the peak of the event. This happened a lot in the Arab Spring, where organizations didn't necessarily have insurance for evacuations as a result of political risk or political instability in a country, and they were ultimately left to fend for themselves on figuring out how to get their people out, when planes, charter flights, all these modes of transportation were already taken up. And there's some more nuanced factors that go into evaluating these policies as well. Whether it's what the trigger event is, if it's something where the State Department is going to have to be the one that dictates that U.S. citizens should leave, and therefore that's when the insurance coverage would be triggered in. That creates a lot of difficulty, because in many cases you're not talking about the safety of the environment, but really when the State Department deems that diplomatic relations can be or should be severed as a result of what's going on in that country. So there's a lot more involvement with that type of trigger. On the other hand, there is an issue as well where policies allow organizations to call in and make a case by case basis or set up predetermined triggers. So those are policies that are much more recommended in our view when folks are evaluating this. And similarly with the evacuation, a lot of major programs are out there today that provide emergency medical and evacuation components. But what folks don't necessarily always understand is that if you have multiple different policies with different carriers, in the event of a claim where it becomes a little bit less clear as to what the initial cause was, whether it was a medical condition, an accident, or an illness that caused an evacuation to be required, that can often create a conflict between the different providers as to who's going to respond and who can ultimately get that person out. So when organizations are looking at how to best protect their folks and how to best entice them to go overseas by having that protection, these are kind of the things that they need to be taken into account, particularly on the international front.
Right. I was thinking about the physical security component for institutions, and in some cases, it would appear that there are insurance options or solutions for the individual student. As we know, most 18 to 22-year-olds are bringing multiple devices to a campus facility and are oftentimes in a campus dorm. And if there were some, flooding or fire issue in a dorm, oftentimes those devices and the physical property of that individual student aren't covered. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those risk factors as well?
Sure. For physical security, I think, and this is another, I think, threat that organizations are trying to figure out the best way to deal with. And I think in this scenario, there's a lot of and insurance. There's a lot of nuance in the language and the type of coverage that's afforded. And in many of the traditional policies that an academic organization may have, such as, again, these business interruption components or even coverage for their actual physical property, for putting aside the actual active shooter incidents and liability that arises of that, some of these lesser sort of visible knock-on effects of these types of events, many of these policies won't actually act or cover these risks if the initial trigger event is an active shooter incident or the initial claim event is an active shooter incident. And that's because in many cases they don't cover sort of that type of exposure. They don't cover, as we've seen in the news recently, when these events become labeled terrorism events, domestic terrorist events. They don't cover those types of events, and so this creates a lot of gaps and exposures for organizations for not, again, just focusing on the liability and the loss of life issue and how to protect against that, but also focusing on the institution and its ability to continue operating after the event transpires. So this is why we think that having a bespoke and customized solution for these types of issues is really a mandate, or should be a mandate for organizations, because it allows them to really better prepare on the front end, bring in additional resources and communications folks that help to not just address the risk as it's going on, but better prepare their folks as well as their students and faculty for how to manage one of these events, how to get through it and limit the impact that it can have and the tragedies as a result of it. A lot of the feedback that we receive is that sometimes, while these programs seem great in nature, that they may be difficult for some smaller institutions to access them, or that they may be cost prohibitive. And that's why we're working, and I know the conversations we've had, Jen, where we're working with organizations like Emerge to create these risk sharing pools where we can make these programs more accessible and really make
Right.
this coverage available to all organizations of all size so that we can help to start better preparing them and hopefully reducing the number of events that occur, and certainly limit the potential downside and loss of life that can result from it.
Sure. Yeah, it's very interesting. And Andreas, you had kind of touched on what is a kind of a thematic element in higher ed today, and that is around cost savings and cost sharing and kind of procurement pooling. I'm wondering for those institutional leaders, whether it's a college university president, a chief information officer, a risk manager, or even a board chair, how might they consider opportunities if their institution is, denominationally affiliated with other regional colleges or part of a consortium or an association to collectively, mitigate risk as well as potentially drive down the cost for that risk management?
No, that's a great question, and I think it's a great segue from sort of the last comment I was just making again with risk sharing and risk pooling. I think the some of these risks are have the potential to be very catastrophic, from cyber to again physical security. Some of these potential exposures can really be catastrophic for an organization, particularly the smaller institutions that may be less financially resilient to these types of exposures or losing IP again, or any kind of issue that might impact future enrollments. So with these networks and with being a highly cooperative and highly I think just information sharing community within the academic and education world, there is an opportunity for them to band together or to pool together, particularly the university and college networks that are out there today, or the associations that are working with universities and institutions like Emerge, where we're doing this actively to help maximize the access to coverage and really leverage the economies of scale that they represent, making not only pricing more affordable on some of these policies, but really making the coverage broader so that there's a greater level of protection. And they're doing this by effectively following the number one rule in insurance, which is the spread of risk. And the base assumption is that if we're able to aggregate the total number of schools that we're insuring, and we're spreading that risk to not just one centralized or concentrated area or state, that gives underwriters more comfort because they're spreading their risk out, and there's less likelihood of all universities being impacted with one singular risk than just one on its own. So those types of approaches, we've done quite a bit of work in the past, putting structures like that together, from municipalities to actual statewide programs, and we're actively pursuing that route with Emerge and creating some very, I think, innovative approaches to making solutions like physical security and cyber coverage more accessible, and providing better coverage to organizations by having the partnership leverage that economies of scale.
Yeah, that's great. One of the larger buckets that we haven't necessarily touched on yet, and it's somewhat of a new solution, is programs related to tuition protection. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in the industry and how higher ed institutions might take advantage of that tuition protection, either providing that for their students or offering it as a solution to students?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And this is tuition protection insurance. It's a program that we've actually developed and are, again, partnering with Emerge to try and promote it to organizations, because we see it as really a vital need in the academic world today. I think tuition costs continue to rise, and the cost of education continues to rise, and it makes it much more difficult for some folks to access higher education. There's also a lot of things of competing factors with online education platforms, and it's becoming harder and more challenging for institutions to recruit new prospective students. So the tuition protection platform, I think, does a few things. It helps one, and most importantly, the student be able to really safeguard the continuity of their education. This type of program helps to protect against the interruption of a student's academic learning experience as a result of the loss of income or from tuition payer. So if their family members, their parent, guardian, what have you, loses their job, passes away, becomes incapacitated, is unable to earn income and continue paying for schooling, the program steps in and pays for that tuition through graduation. It also provides reimbursement costs for medical expenses or illnesses that may affect the student, forcing them to withdraw, and then pays again to have them reinstated, come back and finish the education. It also is important for organizations to consider these types of coverages because it becomes a recruiting tool. It becomes a differentiator for them to be able to promote and say that they value their students, that they're able to provide them access to these types of programs, that should something unthinkable happen, they still have a safeguard and they're able to come back and finish a degree at their institution. And finishing the degree at the college where they started their degree is a huge factor because this means that academic institutions are retaining that student. They're not losing that student, and then if the student decides to go back to school at a later date, they're going to go to maybe a local school now, or they're going to go to another facility. This means that they're actually coming back and they're finishing the degree and paying tuition back to the school. So from a financial perspective, it also helps to build in a little bit more resiliency on that side of the house as well.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So I guess in conclusion, Andreas, and this has been very informative. I think you've done a great job of describing the complexities, the challenges, and I could understand how all of these circumstances that we face in today's kind of current environment, how it could be overwhelming for an institutional leader, whether president, CIO, risk manager, board chair. From your perspective, if you put yourself in their seat, in their shoes, what types of risks would keep you up at night?
That's always a great question. I think the biggest risk that I think as an organization that would keep me awake at night in the academic and domain, I think it's the ones that we've been talking about, but particularly making sure to address cyber risk. I think is one that's top of mind because that has it's not going away, and I think it has to be something that academic institutions are going to grapple with. Largely because the market sees them as a bit of a riskier prospect, and that means that obtaining coverage or obtaining solutions is going to be all the more difficult. So looking at these pooling type of arrangements and ways to make it more accessible would be a top of mind concern. And then the other one I think would also be the concept of differentiation and resiliency in this environment, and that is a bit of a catch-all, but it does tie into how do you differentiate recruiting faculty and retaining faculty, and that's where some international programs may have a play. Same with students. How do you recruit and differentiate by offering distinctive benefits as a result of attending your institution? And lastly, the resiliency component. The bad things are going to happen, unfortunately, and unexpected things are going to happen no matter how hard we plan for them. So looking at ways to transfer that risk or the financial liability that's associated with it and ensure so that we can get more resiliency and make sure that our organizations can come back online and continue operating against even some of these most extreme risks that occur. that would be sort of one of my top concerns.
And I believe, Andreas, you and your organization, Risk Cooperative, have some free available resources that institutional leaders could check out, videos and other types of content. If that is correct, where could they go and seek out that information at this time?
Absolutely. We do quite a bit of thought leadership, writing articles in a lot of major publications, as well as often provide a newsletter and a video series that addresses some of the most pressing and emerging risks. All of this information is available either on the Emerge website at linking to riskcooperative.com or on the riskcooperative.com website as well under the Insights section. The Insights sections will provide the whole list of articles. It'll provide our video series entitled Risk Matters, as well as it'll allow folks to sign up to our newsletter. And then via Emerge, of course, we're going to continue putting out more information, more articles and content, and continue to really address some of the pressing questions that academic institutions have. And I would highly encourage that they contact Emerge with any questions or inquiries that they might have, and we'll always be able to create more content around that and ultimately provide solutions that help organizations mitigate and address these concerns.
Yeah, that's great. So again, that's a series called Risk Matters, and you can find those on the Emerge Education www.emergeedu.com website or the Risk Cooperative website, and check out the Insights section for that as well. And we will continue to offer regular webinar series topics in the future and drill down into some of these risk-related issues and resiliency opportunities that were addressed at a high level today. So Andreas, thanks again for your time today and for sharing your expertise and experience, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.